One of the most barbaric and shocking events in French history saw the former Queen of France, a very much hated woman, be taken to her date with the guillotine inside of Paris. Marie Antoinette was despised by her population, and she suffered the same fate that her husband encountered, the slanted blade of the guillotine taking her head clean off. But what is not as well known is what happened to her remains and body in the decades after her death. In the minutes following, Madame Tussaud allegedly created an eerie death mask of the former queen, and then the queen was thrown inside of a roughly dug public grave, with no marker ever made which would have pointed to her being there. But years later, following the brief restoration of the monarchy, the grave of Marie Antoinette was broken into, and her bones were removed, and what was found was dramatic and shocking, but it also caused people who witnessed the exhumation to faint. But what happened with her exhumation? And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. It was on the 16th of October 1793 that the deposed former Queen Consort of France, Marie Antoinette, was taken from her prison cell to the Palais de la Révolution in Paris. It was here, previously, where her husband, King Louis XVI, had been executed, and she was condemned to death for many crimes. These ranged from defrauding the treasury to even encouraging enemy nations to wage war on France, resulting in treason. She was without a doubt a very luxurious and glamorous queen, but no one would ever imagine that she would encounter the blade of the guillotine. Many thought she'd be rescued, but she was led towards the guillotine sitting in a cart, whilst a priest sat quietly with her. It was claimed that she looked as if she was in a trance as she was coming to terms with her impending fate. However, as she was led up the steps of the scaffold and towards the guillotine, she uttered her final words, saying, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean it," as she accidentally stood on the foot of her executioner. She didn't make any statement after this, and she was strapped to the wooden tilting board, and this was then slid into place underneath the blade of the guillotine. The executioner performed a few checks, and then he released the blade, and instantly the head of Marie Antoinette was taken clean off. There are many images of the brutal execution that exist, and one of these even shows the executioner, or his assistant, parading Marie's head on top of a long pole, using this huge stick to show her head to the crowd. But following her execution, the body and head of Marie was placed onto the cart which had previously carried her, and the body was then taken to the nearby Madeleine Cemetery, a place where her husband, the king, had been buried, and where many victims of the guillotine were also interred. This ceremony contained many roughly dug graves of prominent figures who were executed during the Terror, and the grave diggers were already digging the Queen's grave when her body was brought there. In fact, the grave diggers did take a short break, which then allowed Madame Tussaud to create a death mask of the Queen, and she managed to then create a waxwork figure of Marie in her final moments. At the time of her burial, it was decided that in an act of shame that the head of the Queen should be placed between her legs, in an act of disgrace symbolising the death of a criminal in the eyes of the revolutionaries. But for a number of years, the grave of Marie Antoinette, the final Queen of France, remained inside the Madeleine Cemetery undisturbed, and it was no secret where she had been buried. Some Frenchmen even gave tours to people of the graveyard to show where the King and the Queen lay to rest, and some decorations were even allowed on top of the grave. One visitor who attended the grave said, "On the 4th of September 1814, I visited the sacred place which contains the remains of our sainted King, Louis XVI, and his virtuous and unfortunate Queen, Marie Antoinette. Thanks to the care of M. Delaclos and his daughters, good Frenchmen can come to this place and find consolation. Mademoiselle Delaclos will be pleased to accompany you. Her gentle and sorrowful voice inspires sacred respect for these martyrs. The cemetery is the Rue d'Anjou, and is called the Madeleine Cemetery. A grave at one end of the garden contains 133 bodies, buried on the 6th of June 1770, those killed on the 31st of May at the fireworks held to celebrate the marriage of Louis and Marie Antoinette. Another grave, adjoining Sir Delaclos' garden, has the bodies of 4 priests and 500 Swiss guards killed on the 10th of August. A third grave contains 500 further Swisses. The tomb of Louis XVI was placed here on the 21st of January 1793 at 10:30 in the morning. A pair of 8 foot deep was then dug, and a great deal of quicklime placed in it. The body of the king was placed in a wooden coffin with quicklime on the top. On the 16th of October 1793, the body of the queen, his wife, was buried near him with a similar quantity of quicklime. However, in the decades following, and with the restoration of the French monarchy briefly, there was a call to give Marie Antoinette and her husband, King Louis XVI, a decent burial. Because of this, it was settled that they should be dug up and then interred inside the Basilica of St. Denis, along with many other kings and queens. The digging of her grave began in the January of 1815, and on the first day the Queen's bones were found. It was known where she was roughly buried, and when the grave was opened, it was found that a layer of quicklime had solidified over the coffin, which had preserved Marie's remains inside quite well. Some bones of her were found, including her skull, which was intact, found between her legs. Also discovered, amazingly, were a set of stockings from the conciergerie prison where she had dressed before her execution, and also 2 elastic garters. But harrowingly, on her skull were pieces of the Queen's white hair, perfectly preserved. One witness about the events claimed, after the workmen, several of whom had witnessed the interment of the Queen, had opened to the depth of 5 feet, a space 10 feet in length by 5 or 6 in breadth, we found a bed of lime 10 or 11 inches deep, which we ordered to be removed with the greatest care. Under this bed we distinctly perceived the outline of a coffin, about 5 or 6 inches in length. Following these traces, we discovered in the depth of the lime several pieces of board still fastened together. In this coffin we found a number of bones, but several were wanting, having undoubtedly been reduced to dust. The skull was entire, and its position indicated incontestably that it had been severed from the body. We also found remains of clothing, and particularly 2 elastic garters in good preservation. The whole were placed in a chest and locked up. In another chest were deposited the earth and lime found mixed with the bones. For many people who witnessed the exhumation it was moving, and they burst into tears. The workers placed the bones of the Queen into a chest, and these were then loaded into the back of a wagon, and the chest was processed by candlelight. It took a little longer to find the remains of King Louis XVI, and his remains were not in a very good way at all compared to Marie's. But then the preparations were made to bury her inside of the Basilica of St. Denis, along with her husband. The wooden chest was placed inside of a coffin, and these were then given a proper funeral. It was said of this that, when all these attendants have taken their places, the service commenced. The princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies and their assistants, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the vault, into the royal vault, which Monsieur and the 2 princes, his sons, descended, and protracted themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service at St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. To perpetuate the memory of these august victims, the King has ordained that solemn funeral services shall be performed annually in all the churches of the kingdom on the 21st of January for the repose of their souls, of Louis XVI, on the 16th day of October for that of his royal consort, and that on those days the court shall wear mourning, and the public offices, court of justice, exchange, and theatres be closed. From my research, the bones of Marie Antoinette have never been disturbed since this moment, and the royal vault where she was lowered into and left to rest has never been opened. She today has a simple black marble slab outlining the place of her remains. Marie Antoinette may still be today a controversial figure, but she suffered a harrowing execution during the Reign of Terror. that came following the success of the French Revolution. She may have been a queen, but she probably should never have faced the guillotine, and it's surprising that no one decided to save her from her impending fate. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.